In the firehouse, every second counts. The best tool for the job? A well-rested firefighter. Dreamseat firehouse furniture, built for durability, designed for comfort, because your best tool is your team at their best.
Hey guys, welcome to episode 2 of Beyond the Headlines with Chris and Angie. Today we're going to be talking with Deputy Chief Michael DeStefano. This show is really truly about diving deeper into these articles beyond the headlines. His article is Wartime and Peacetime Leadership in the Fire Service. If you guys have seen Tailboard Talks recently, we had been talking about leadership. We thought that this would be a great opportunity to touch base with that with Chief DeStefano. So, Chris?
So enjoy. There's going to be a lot of carryover. We're excited to talk to him. We're going to have some good stories, some good leadership points for officers and aspiring officers, and we're going to see where this thing goes. So we're going to go beyond the headlines.
Yes.
With Chief DeStefano.
Correct.
Good?
Very good.
All right. Welcome, Chief. We're here and excited to talk to you today about your article in Firefighter Nation. Really quickly, just introduce yourself, give us a little overview of the article you wrote, and then we're going to go kind of deep into it and get your feelings behind it.
Perfect. Well, thank you guys for having me on here. My name is Michael DeStefano. I've been in the fire service for about 21 years now. Currently, I am a deputy chief down in town of Jupiter, Florida, which is a really, really cool dynamic because it's a department that is just forming. We don't actually start running calls until 2026. So we're building up this department, and the department currently is contracted with the county who we're taking over services from. So a lot of really good things of being able to kind of create our own culture from the ground up. Prior to that, I worked for Brevard County Fire Rescue, which is a 500 plus personnel department. I think we had 32 stations when I was there. I was there for 19 years, which is where I got most of my leadership training and education experiences and everything like that from. The article that I wrote most recently with Firefighter Nation was the wartime and peacetime leadership for the fire service or for the fire officer. And it's basically a general overview of the importance of knowing positive leadership styles that you're going to utilize on the fireground versus at the fire station, and knowing that there's a difference between those two. I mean, I've gone through multiple classes. I'm actually just turned in my dissertation for my doctorate in strategic leadership. I turned it in on Friday, so 3 days ago. And one of the things that we learn is all these different types of leadership styles: servant leadership, transformational leadership, all these different things. They're great leadership styles. But what you don't understand or you don't learn from that is when to use them and when not to use them. And the fire service is really unique in the fact that when we're on a call, we need to utilize different leadership styles than when we're at the fire station. What works at the station does not work on a call. And that's basically because of the fact that if I slow down and I start thinking about, trying to be this nice, inclusive and democratic leader on a fire call, someone's going to get hurt. Someone's going to get injured. Someone's going to get killed. And we can't have that. We have to realize that that's a different type of mindset and a different type of leadership that's required for that. Going back though to that article that I wrote, one thing that I almost had a little bit of anxiety naming it and kind of titling it this, of saying wartime versus peacetime leadership, because when I look at the fire service and I look at what we do, and I'll be the first one to say that I absolutely hate the word combat when it's related to firefighting, because I feel like it doesn't belong there, with combat that you see from a military or from a police or anything like that, it's a completely different dynamic than what we deal with. Granted, we both can get injured on a call, we both can get killed on a call, but it's such a dynamic that's different where, if we go on a call and we get hurt, it's usually something bad that's occurred. It may not be our fault, but it's something bad has occurred that caused that injury. The police officers and military, when they go into an environment, a wartime environment, a combat environment, if it's a good outcome, they're still walking away injured. because of the fact that they've most likely hurt or killed somebody else. And so I really hate combining those two, of the combat or wartime with the fire service. But at the same time, when I write articles, I have to use whatever common language that I can utilize to kind of make it make sense to the reader. So they're not like, what the heck's this guy talking about? So.
Well, I think it's important to set that, especially with the situation you're in with establishing a new department, though. And you talked about creating that culture that you want to have. I don't think there's anything wrong with overselling it a little bit just to establish what you're all about, right? And so then you can always come off it a little bit. But if you say, like, what I really want is just a little bit of stress leadership and then a little bit more stress leadership, and the guys are like, oh, this is easy, I can be middle of the road the whole time, and then something happens and you're asking to ramp it up, now you're asking above and beyond what your expectations are. But if you oversell it a little bit, I think you're safe with calling it wartime and peacetime, because I know you've seen your 20 something years of being there, there's definitely some elevated emotions that might make you feel like you're in combat even inside the fire station. And so that's one thing we wanted to ask you about, was like, even though you're not on the streets in a necessarily that conflict with an external force or with a call or anything like that, that transition inside the department of like sitting at the table, peacetime, all of a sudden some guy comes in and says something goofy, now it's wartime. That has to be one of the most difficult management positions to be in. So what kind of things have you seen, or what kind of advice have you given to up and coming lieutenants, to yourself, to people that are aspiring to be in your department? Not specifically, don't want to get you in trouble, but you're sitting there and you got to manage everything, right? What you allow, you endorse kind of thing. So what's some advice you can give to people, even when you're in that peacetime environment, to still tap into what you need from on the fireground?
So in my position that I was at when I left Brevard County, I was the assistant chief of professional development, which also included all investigations and discipline, which I got to see lots and lots and lots of really fun things that I would not wish on anybody. But to go back to what you just said, though, I think you kind of nailed it. What you allow is what you're going to become. So when you have those issues in the fire service or at the fire station, one of the things that I really suggest to the newer fire officers is to basically set those expectations early of, hey, don't make me be the boss. I am the boss, but don't make me be the boss. When you make me be the boss, bad things happen, kind of deal. We can be friends. We can be the leader-follower relationship. But if I have to take off the role of being the officer of the station and put on the role of being the boss of the station, things are going to go downhill. And setting those expectations early, whether it's a simple as, just having that coffee table talk of, this is what I expect from my guys. This is what we should do. This is how we should act. This is how we should act on calls. This is how we should act at the station. Or if you have to, formalize it and put it in paper, put it in writing and say, look, these are the expectations. I want everybody to be aware of it, and have that discussion, that conversation with them. But one thing that I highly suggest, and I've actually talked to a few recent officers that I've coached a little bit, is when you're having that discussion of expectations, ask them what their expectations are as well. What do they want out of you as an officer and as their leader? Because we all go into things with whatever we have up in our mind. We don't really think about, how we're being perceived by other people or what they want. We just assume what we want is what everybody wants. So having those discussions of not only how I want the shift to be ran, but how do you guys want to be led, and what are your goals? What are your vision and the outcome that you seek in this role at the fire service?
Do you have any stories where you had to course correct leadership, whether that was in the firehouse or on the fireground?
Oh, absolutely. So, and it's not necessarily, I like that term, course correct. So we've had multiple issues, and I used to also do training as well as the training chief for Brevard. Prior to that, I was a training lieutenant and everything. So there was a lot of, as you put it, course correction of new hires, of younger firefighters. Brevard County is a very, very young department in the aspect that it has extremely high turnover. So we were looking at about 60 to 65% of the department was less than 5 years on the job. So a lot of young people that were in there, a lot of young in their career. And on top of it, we had a lot of people that are coming straight out of high school into the program. So a lot of what we were having to course correct was not only disciplinary issues or even firefighter issues, but was actually just life skill issues. We had multiple instances where you would have trickle over from people's lives that would kind of blend into the station, whether that would be, for lack of better terms, relationship issues with firefighters and the same girl.
Oh, interesting.
Unfortunately, yeah. As well as, things that you would see from almost like a frat house kind of atmosphere, because a lot of these guys were coming out of high school. They really hadn't had that experience of being adults yet, and they were learning how to on the job. So from a combat, and again, I hate that word, but I'm going to use it anyway. From a combat standpoint, there's been a lot of situations where you'll have to course correct on actual incidents. And most of the time that came from the lower levels. It came from the fire officer level. So I didn't do so much course correcting when I was a district chief, which is similar to a battalion chief at most departments. When I was incident command, I wasn't doing much of that. I was basically just running the scene. I did notice that as a fire officer, as an officer on an engine or a truck company, that there were instances where we'd have other officers that would be on scene, and you'd see their anxiety level increasing quicker and quicker. You hear the typical person, you hear them on the radio, and they start at about a 3 when they get on scene, and they're giving you, size up, and then they do their 360 and it goes to like a volume of 5, and then they're about to make entry, and now it's a volume of 8, and then they actually make entry and they're talking on the radio, and all you hear is just breathing on the SCBA, and they're trying to scream through the radio, and you're like, dude, just shut up, just stop, just calm down. And a lot of that course correction was literally an officer going face to face with them and going, hey, dude, calm down, relax, run your crew. It's okay. And just kind of creating that peer-to-peer guidance rather than a chief down guidance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and you bring up an interesting point when you're talking about, the department that you were on that was majority younger firefighters. And it's something that I notice a lot, I think even at my own department, that the younger firefighters versus the mid and then the ones who have been there who are like retiring in a couple years all disagree on almost like the type of leadership roles, right? Mm. So do you think that leaders have to adapt their leadership roles to the younger generation? Or do you think that the younger generation has to understand the leadership roles and what the end game is? It is, when we're choosing things. I know that you mentioned servant leadership, which is something that I think is getting really popular with military adopted that, and then the fire service is a little bit adopting that. I think that maybe younger generation generally really likes that. But then you talk about kind of how you can still be this, but then have to kind of flip the switch when needed. And it's almost like, how do you approach that with a younger generation so you're not finding these really high turnovers? Or I'd be curious what your advice for that would be, or if you're seeing kind of the same thing, or if you're noticing that with different generational firefighters.
So I love the fact that you brought that up. That's a great kind of lead in. So the dissertation that I did for my doctorate is on leadership and the impact of leadership and the challenges that they face on entry-level firefighters and how it affects their morale, which eventually turns to turnover. Low morale means higher turnover, right? And when I was doing the research, I had interviewed 17, I think, fire officers and 21 firefighters. And what I did was I interviewed them individually. I asked them a bunch of leadership questions, how they wanted to be led, what kind of leadership styles that they thought was the best, what was the negatives, et cetera, et cetera. And then I brought them into focus groups where all the firefighters, I had them in groups of about 3 to 5. And then the officers I had in groups of 3 to 5, and then asked them generally the same questions to kind of see how their answers would be, if it would differ from the individual ones. And With the firefighters, actually, I'll be honest with you, with all of them, firefighters and fire officers, the number one response for the most beneficial, positive leadership style they had was leading by example. And they said that they wanted to see leaders that were able to do the job and the tasks that they were giving them, as well as ones that would actually partake with them, especially when it came to training. They didn't want the person who was like, hey, we need to go climb ladders. Okay, we're gonna go outside and I'm gonna watch you throw ladders. No, they wanted the one that was gonna throw the ladder with them, that one that actually wanted to invest their time with them and grow the crew rather than try to grow the student. And the most negative leadership style that was there was micromanaging. And they everything that was across the board. I think every single person, other than maybe one, said that they hated working for a micromanager. And it's funny because the firefighters and the officers that I interviewed ranged from age like 19 all the way up to, I think, 50, 57, I think was the oldest officer that I had. But the answers were all very similar. And I think that the generational changes that we see aren't necessarily leadership changes. I think it's just the fact that they all want the same thing. It's just when it occurs, they don't know what it is yet. So, for example, when we look at servant leadership style, servant leader, a servant officer is going to go and reach out and they're going to try to empower their crews. They're going to try to empower the employee, and they're going to give them the resources that they need to do their job well. Now, from a level of a motivated firefighter who wants to be the best, they're going to take that and they're going to run with it. They're going to absorb every single bit of knowledge that they have. Now, a different firefighter mindset, regardless of age or generation, that may be more entitled, will look into it and say, okay, I want you to give me basically everything. I want you to provide me the job. I want you to give me the money. Why am I not making as much as the guy who's been here 20 years? This is ridiculous kind of thing. Why does he get to sit on the couch and I don't want to be on the couch too? And I think it's more of an entitlement issue than it is a generational issue. If that makes sense.
No, that totally makes sense.
So how do you not break it? You're not like breaking a horse or anything, but how do you course correct that kid and be like, this is not to enhance your entitlement. This is to give you the opportunity to do better. What kind of conversations have to happen with that? Because I can see it was getting kind of hairy. That kid's just going to keep expecting, if it's not addressed, that one's going to keep expecting more, and everybody's going to keep getting it, and the rift will eventually divide where that guy's just off on his own island now, because eventually people stop putting up with it, and they'll know he's just abusing the system and getting away with it. So unfortunately, if you don't course correct him, he's only going to hurt himself. And you might not want to, because you might want him to go hurt himself and get away from everybody, but you still kind of got to bring it back in, right? So what's an effective way then to kind of steer him in the right direction and make him see what you're giving him instead of just a gift? And now it's not transactional, but there's an expectation.
Absolutely. So I think one of the big factors of that is creating that environment, creating that crew that's going to do it, and realizing that it's not necessarily a one-to-one leadership, like mentoring mentees type situation that occurs. So funny enough, my first article I ever wrote that was published was in, I think, 2015. And it was an article called Family Dynamic. And it was basically the breakdown of the fire station and comparing it to a family. So you had the infant was our brand new guy that got hired on, right? The toddler was when they were a probationary firefighter. Then they graduate up to like elementary school age that they've gotten off probation. They're still learning and everything like that. Then you have the older brother. That's the senior firefighter, usually like just outside the teenage years and everything. And then you have the fire officer, which is dad. The chief is grandpa. And then the fire chief is like, the ancient elder that's 7 generations up, whatever they may be. He's the guy at the center of the tribe that everybody comes to for wisdom, and he's probably just in the corner drooling on himself. But that's okay, because that's probably the role I play now. But I think going back to that, though, is in order to have that guidance, you have to have that senior firefighter that's invested. They want to hear it from their peers more than they want to hear it from like I said, the dad character, everybody feels like they have to rebel against dad. They all want to make dad proud, but at the same time, they're always rebelling against, oh, if dad said this, I'm going to do the opposite of it. But then that senior firefighter, that older brother comes in and says, hey, this is how we do things on this crew. This is what we do. This is why we do it and everything like that. They're like, oh, okay, I'm going to follow that lead and I'm going to follow in with that. So creating that kind of culture and that kind of crew is essential for basically any leadership to occur.
I think that, and you bring up that dynamic, I think overall, and Angie and I are seeing it, and my department's in the same boat that you're in, where now we have at least a third, and then the next 2 months now we're going to have about half the department has less than 10 years of a 140 person department. So we're seeing this massive shift, and what that's bringing in is officers get promoted earlier and earlier because as the top leaves, the bottom comes up. So now instead of having that dynamic of like toddler, middle school, parent, grandpa, the middle schooler, and not in a disparaging way, the middle schooler is now the dad. And you have the dad who's now the middle schooler because that guy at 8 years gets promoted and now he's got to tell the 24-year guy what to do. And that's a very difficult dynamic. So how can that young officer, and then you might have answered already, so don't feel like you need to drill it again. Feel free to tell a story if you'd like. How would that young officer talk to that 25-year guy and be like, I know I've been on for 8 years. I know you've been around for 2 decades longer than me, but I need you. Like, I need you to build this crew. How can that conversation happen in a way that doesn't totally take out the needs of the officer, but also gets a little bit of buy-in from the senior guy?
Well, I think you just nailed it right there, is the fact that you're empowering them. You're letting them know that they're valuable and that they're a part of the crew and that they're a part of the leadership process. That it's not necessarily, I'm the boss, everybody has to follow me. It's more of, I want you to help me and help the entire crew. And another aspect of that goes back to what I was finding with the research was that leading by example factor. If you're going out and you're training with your crew and you're showing that you're a part of the team and that you want to see the entire team succeed rather than just building up you as a leader, they're going to have a lot more buy-in to that. That goes back to that servant leadership approach. You're serving your people. You're serving that 25-year guy and saying, hey, look, we're going to try to make the fire service better than we found it. You only have maybe a year left before you retire, but can you help me? Can you provide that older brother guidance to these people and really kind of making sure that they feel valuable? I mean, I think that's one of the biggest aspects.
I'm going to kind of go a different direction real quick. Just a little different direction.
You can course correct.
So yeah, I'm going to course correct this conversation. Obviously, you were on the prior department for 19 years. You're clearly extremely knowledgeable, incredible, and with everything.
All right, enough. Get to the question.
I said, okay, whatever. The question.
You're great. I'm just saying.
You have high education with this. You're credible. So.
Oh, they said incredible.
No, credible.
Credible. All right.
You're credible. You have a lot of experience, clearly. So you talk about all the different types of leadership styles. Now, what happens when your wartime leadership style, so your authoritarian style, your micromanager, what happens when those people are promoted into deputy chief positions, battalion chief positions, and now those types of leadership are your admin or your upper, right? And so you have maybe poor leadership, and I almost feel like sometimes it creates officers to do like what you had said, the laissez-faire kind of thing, because when issues do arise, right, because of the leadership, because of it being above, they do tend to bury their heads in the sand, right? So, and you had mentioned that in your article. I would love to know what your advice is, because Chris and I had talked about how we're in these are 30-year long careers. I had misinterpreted something that he had said prior when we had this conversation, and I was like, oh, okay, I know what he's saying. Because at first we're like, I'm saying how if your leadership doesn't align with ethics and stuff like that, you're not stuck somewhere. You do have the ability to leave and whatnot. However, people who, you're for the 30 years, you're not always going to be under perfect leadership. It's inevitable. We're not always going to be under leadership we agree with or whatever the case may be. But when you find that that is what it is, and it could knowingly get worse, right? How do we navigate? How do blue shirts, officers, how do we navigate through poor leadership when we know what's going on? How do we gain morale at a really low morale spot because of it? I really would love what your advice is on that, because not all of us can just leave.
So, good Lord, the questions you just asked are phenomenal because of the fact that this is actually another big aspect of my dissertation, my research. And one of the things that I discovered with it was the difference between micro and macro culture. And another one that somebody, I don't even remember who it was one of my fire officers coined, which was social morale, which is so good. But basically, to start to answer that question there, when you have those issues and those people are getting promoted into those positions of leadership, and when I say leadership, I mean like the definition of rank more than actual leadership, because I think leadership can be from the ground up. Everybody can lead, but from those rank areas, first and foremost, hopefully you don't work for a department that's promoting that kind of behavior and that's promoting those kind of styles. But we all know that there is a culture and a more of a mantra and a mindset that, you know, the person who's been there longest is getting promoted. And I know with Chris, like you said, with having those younger and younger officers, they're going to look to the person who's been an officer for 15 years and go, "Hey, you're all I got. I'm sorry, I have, you know, will you take that position?" Regardless of whether they're qualified, regardless of if they're good or if they're a good leader or anything like that. So when those occur and when you have those people in places of the higher ranks like that, I think the biggest thing you can do is just attempt to lead up the chain of command, to be the best leader that you can be and continue to push that up further and further. And when I say push it up, I mean push the ideas, push the committees, push anything you can. And I'll say that I've been blessed to have good leadership, and I've been blessed to have really poor leadership. And I learned from both of those. And that was the greatest thing that I could have had. And I think that actually helped me immensely in my career, is the fact that I saw what I didn't want to be. I had a chief a long time ago that told me if I ever wanted to move into the chief officer level position, that I basically needed to either A, not care anymore about my crew, or B, carry my resume in my back pocket. I said, okay. So when I moved into the chief level there, that was basically what I did, is I kept my resume in my back pocket. And I mean, I can tell you, I've had conversations with higher ups at leadership, at government leadership and everything, where my statement was, I was looking for a job when I found this one. I'm sorry, I don't agree with you. This is where we're at. I was looking for a job when I found this one. And a lot of times it gets pushed to the wayside. You know, emotions flare up. We have a good little argument. And then later on, that person looks back and goes, yeah, you know what? Mike might have been a little bit right. You know, maybe we should go this route. And that kind of goes to that leading up the chain of command. With that being said, though, sometimes it doesn't go my way. Sometimes it doesn't go the route that I thought it was going to go. And I get my bluff called. And I'll be honest with you, the reason why I left the organization I used to work for was because there was a lot of leadership conflicts, we'll call them. And that kind of led to my search outside of that organization for another place. So going back down to the fire officer level, and like you call it, the blue shirt level there, this is where we go into that macro micro culture dynamic. So you have a macro culture of a department, and that's the overall morale of the entire department. And a lot of times, depending on what's going on, especially when it comes to union negotiations, when it comes to different aspects of pay, benefits, and things like that, the morale can be really, really low. But at a micro level, like at your station, you can have extremely high morale. In fact, when I was doing the interviews, I think other than 2 or 3 people, they all said that the morale at their stations was extremely high. They loved going to work. They loved having those shifts with their guys, and it was fantastic. They got along. They're like, "Oh, the morale of the department's terrible." But at my station, it's fantastic. And I was like, man, this is really weird because they're all saying the same thing from the same organization. And I'm like, how is the morale of the organization not high then if everyone is so high from the station standpoint? And then I started looking a little bit further and I said, why are these three people, what do they have in common? And it turns out they were floaters. They didn't have a station. They didn't have an assigned crew. They were the ones that were getting from place to place to place. And they never had the consistency to grow together and to build up that camaraderie. And that's why they thought the whole world was falling apart. It was terrible. Morale's horrible. They're like, at the stations, it's horrible. And the department is horrible. And I'm like, oh, wow, okay. So as I started looking into it and started talking to them now as a focus group and putting all the crews together and saying, hey, how's morale at your stations? Here's the funny part. They all told me terrible. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just told me it was good 5 minutes ago and it was just me and you talking. But when I have you in a focus group, now everybody came together and had that consensus of no, it's actually terrible at the stations on the small level. And that's where that social morale aspect came in. It was so much easier for them not knowing each other and not working together to say that the world is on fire. The world is terrible. Everything is negative. But then when you had the crews that I did focus groups as well with the actual individual crew. When I had them together, it was okay. It was, oh, no, things are good here. We love it here. And I'm like, oh, now I'm starting to see it's easier to play the game of you assume everybody wants to be negative, then we'll all be negative together. But if you have your crew that you're constantly with and it's positive, everybody wants to stay positive. So the advice that I would give that officer and from that lower level, no matter what you have going on in your organization, even if the sky is falling and it's terrible and you have trucks breaking down and you have rats in your station, the pay is horrible, you have turnover, mandatory overtime, all that good stuff. I think the best thing you can do is control your bubble and just try to make your bubble as solid and cohesive as you can possibly be. Because the reality is the guys that are up in the office, the admin chiefs, when you're in a fire, they're not the ones pulling you out. They're not the ones running the calls with you. They don't, not to say they don't care, but they don't see that from that individual perspective. They're not the one that's up with you at 2:00 in the morning after you just ran a pediatric code and you guys are trying to work through it. Your crew is your family, and treating it as your family is the only way you're going to survive and the only way you're going to keep morale high. So
that's awesome, man.
Yeah,
I
really
want to
good.
bring it back to a smaller level too, because we've had conflicts on my department where, and I know you've seen this too, where guys will act out on the smallest level, expecting it to affect the chief at the highest level. I'm like, he's giving me all this stuff to do. I'm not going to do this and this today. I'm like, that's not hurting the chief. That's hurting me. Like, you're giving me more work to do. Do something bigger and piss off the chief, not me. Like the self-inflicted wounds of our own crew, thinking it's going to get to the top, and the chief's going to be like, I can't believe he didn't vacuum today. He must be really mad at me. Like, no, man, that just means that I'm sitting in someone else's mess and I got to do it. So that's such a great perspective. And I guess what I'm curious of is, like, over your doctorate, over all the interviews you had, did you have a chance, and can you pick out one or two places where your leadership or your style or your perspective changed on this stuff? Did you uncover anything that really stood out at you of like, oh, wow, we're starting this new department. When I go there or when I start establishing these things, I got to write this down and bring this over, because that's something I didn't even think about before.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of things that I noticed that I hadn't really thought of, and a couple. I mean, there were things that like they're in my back of my head, and I was like, oh, okay, this makes sense when someone said something. But the biggest aspect, and I really thought going into it that everyone was going to tell me, oh, servant leadership, that's the leadership style we want, and then seeing that it was actually leading by example, and seeing how impactful camaraderie really was of the crews. That was a big one. And that's something that I'm actually do a podcast a little bit here for my own podcast about positivity and things like that. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is the impact that we can have when we're building a department that other places might not have the ability to do. But one of the things, like with the fire stations, is making it so that we have constant focused and frequent collisions. And by that I mean, I want my guys constantly together. So like I know we look at the fire stations and the stations that I used to have where, I don't know how you guys are with how old your stations are, but we used to have a lot of open bunk rooms, and it was, 8 bunks that are all in the bunk room. And then now we're getting to the point where everybody has their individual room. They have their own bathroom. They have all this different stuff. And this basically like you're taking a dorm where now everybody has their own little tiny section of the castle. And when they're not on a call, what do? They go to their sections and they're hide. They got their TVs, they got their computer, they're doing whatever they want, and they're not talking to each other, communicating with each other. So one of the things that we're looking at with like building the stations is, we have to have the individual rooms, but we want to make it so that we're not necessarily putting TVs in all the rooms. We're making it so that they want to be in the kitchen area, the main area. They want to be in the day room. They want to be conversing with each other and having those constant collisions. So that way they're building up camaraderie and they're building it up as a family. And don't get me wrong, I think there's going to be some people that are going to butt heads, and we're going to have all kinds of cool like investigations and stuff from it, but I'm okay with it.
I have to say that's probably like my biggest pet peeve when everyone's like, oh yeah, let's watch a movie. The movie goes on.
Yeah.
Everyone.
Well,
I'm like, hello, who's watching the movie?
Yeah, I can tell you. So I've been not on both ends of the spectrum of the bunk room thing. I worked in an open bunk room when I was a contract medic, and it was miserable. Like it was hilarious.
Thank God.
A lot of entertainment, but for sleeping it was just the worst because I occasionally talk in my sleep. Some other guys had like night terrors. Some guys would walk around. It was just bananas, right? I do know stations with other departments that have the opposite end where there is a door and a TV and it's like your own little apartment in there. I wouldn't go that far, but I can tell you that in my department, there's a big push now for at least getting walls that go all the way up on 2 sides. So if someone's light's on, it's not bugging you. It's still easy to kick someone's bed and get them up for a call and like yell for them. You're not opening a door, but at the same time, you can still have a little bit of light blockage and a little bit of privacy. So Chief, I don't have influence. I don't know what Jupiter's like. I don't mean to encroach, but for the love of God, please put walls up in your bunk room at least. So when I get up and I'm sleepwalking, I don't walk into somebody else. And then there's going to be an investigation because they're going to beat the crap out of me. So that's the only thing I can speak up the chain on. I'm flexing my leadership a little bit, but just put walls up a little bit.
No, they're getting their own bunk rooms and everything like that. But we're just making it so that they're not the most comfortable room on the planet where they just want to stay in there all day long. I want them to be together.
Yeah,
yes.
The open bunk room concept is a lot like when places put spikes on park benches so people can't sleep on them. That's what the open bunk room is. It's a direct deterrent to behavior, and that's not a good one. But
it sounds like you definitely had some people that snored in your bunk room.
It was like 10 people. It was a bigger station. It was just a madhouse. It was absolutely bananas. You had to, if you didn't run any calls, you still went home tired because the bunk room was was that frat house that you were talking about. It was not a great place to be. It was fun, but it was not a great place to be.
Yeah, it's good for a couple of times.
That's it. It's good memories. I'm glad our memories now.
I honestly could not imagine that. I couldn't imagine that. I'm so happy I never experienced that.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I already want to like suffocate the people who are snoring.
Yeah.
So I'm just like, there's been times I've slept on the recliner for like, because I'm just like, I can't do this, or I'm like going in the ambulance and sleeping on the bench.
Oh God.
I'm just like,
all right, let's course correct this
all right,
conversation
sorry.
now.
All right.
Chief, do you got anything else you want to throw out there?
Yeah,
This
do you
has been
have
really
like
good.
what do you want to leave everybody with from your article?
I think the biggest thing that I want to leave with this past article is basically there is no right or wrong leadership style. It's basically taking what works for you and for your crew and knowing when to apply it, whether it's on a fire scene or whether it's at the station. Being able to realize that, hey, okay, this is going to work best for this is going to work best for this, and then applying it and executing it. And not getting stuck in that rut of one leadership style is the best, and I have to only use that. And if anyone doesn't use that, they're wrong.
Awesome. Do you have any, I don't know, since you're basically getting a doctorate in this. So for people who are coming up in the ranks or something, even like a blue shirt, do you know of any leadership classes specifically or anything that you would ever recommend them if they wanted to learn a little bit more about this or try to maybe even unlearn
Yeah.
something.
Some good resources that we can
Good
look to.
resources
Yeah.
for people.
So I would suggest two things. I would suggest, honestly, podcasts. There's so much information that we can get for free from watching podcasts that gives you all kinds of insight, all kinds of experiences, as well as you get basically like a free class from it. I mean, there's tons of programs and certificates and degrees that you can take. And I'll say that in the fire service, I would be borderline weary of them because a lot of it is what I call corporate handholding. It's the really great classes for the private sector, for the business sector of HR, and we're all going to get together and kumbaya and things like that don't necessarily work for the fire service. I would suggest podcasts and reading, and then I would also suggest, I think this is the biggest one, is getting a mentor and finding that person in your own organization or even an organization that's close enough by that you can meet in person, and having that mentor that's able to really dive into where you're at in your career and give those suggestions, give that accountability as well of saying, hey, did you do this? And if not, why didn't you do this? And having that person that really helps you to grow up. For lack of better terms, it's the kid that's finding that dad figure, that father figure. And I think that's where your biggest growth is going to come from. Learning how to be a leader is from that aspect of that coach and that mentor.
Awesome. Well, thank you for diving beyond the headlines with us. And if anyone wants to read, it's Wartime and Peacetime Leadership in the Fire Service. You can find it on Firefighter Nation. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Chief DeStefano. We seriously enjoyed this conversation beyond probably what I could even explain. This was a really good conversation. I learned a lot.
Yep.
Thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
In the firehouse, every second counts. The best tool for the job? A well-rested firefighter. Dreamseat Firehouse Furniture, built for durability, designed for comfort, because your best tool is your team at their best.